Oh, hey! I didn't see you there. I was, just catching up on story. While I have you here, Saga of Tanya the Evil's been a sort of pesky leech that I just can't seem to shake. Almost to the point of wanting to grab a drill and just bore it out. And it's a kinda story, so there's that little connective thread for the intro right there. Just, got the best segues in these videos. It's what I'm known for. But this is where my reputation precedes me, because you see, I'm more the guy who binge watches an anime in a day or two and then uses Wikipedia to fill in the gaps for my scripts. So that should tell you something when I'm taking my time to not just watch the show, but read it as well. All of it. Which is a damn feat, because I hate reading. So let's break out of my typical wheelhouse and review a light novel series, starting with what amounts to the first arc, which I guess would just be the entirety of the anime. This wasn't weird, was it? A rough outline of the events of the series is probably in order, and I'll use the anime to illustrate that as best as I can to save myself some time. The Saga of Tanya the Evil follows a middle-aged man who works in HR at a company. He prided himself on being useful to his workplace, peace-loving, utilitarian, and a hardcore free-market capitalist. Hooray. This led to him firing a particular employee with harsh words before he was unceremoniously killed by said disgruntled employee by shoving him in front of a train. It's at this point the man is met with an entity claiming itself to be God, who's really just there to complain. The protagonist rejects his claims as unscientific and illogical, which annoys the being, as it fundamentally views the lack of faith in it as the problem with society, and so it thrusts the protagonist into the cycle of reincarnation once again, with the caveat of his memories still being intact so that he can learn from his previous life experience, and gain the faith he's lacking. I would personally think removing his memories would accomplish that better, as he's a clean slate at that point, but hey, what do I know? It's then that he wakes up in an orphaned infant girl's body in a Germany analog circa 1913. With no real family and lacking the basic means for survival, his comfortable life that granted him the luxury of atheism was thoroughly destroyed. At least that's what this being hopes. Luckily for the protagonist, now named Tanya Degurachev, a growing geopolitical climate is making war increasingly more likely, and being born in the Empire, the military-industrial complex is in full swing. So that fulfills some desirable working conditions of a strict, merit-based, logical structure with upwards mobility. And pay. Too bad she would need to be an adult to join. Or not. The most significant difference is magic exists in this world, so now a 9-year-old Tanya, having aptitude in magic, is given an exception to sign up for the military. Explained in-universe as the army, desperate for mages, takes anyone with magic abilities if they volunteer. To which she does, because that way she can have the cushy life of an officer. After her basic training, she's stationed in the northern peninsula of the Empire, a region called Norden for combat exercises as a spotter for artillery. As this world skipped the First World War, the Empire is ever increasing its military power to break free from its landlocked nature with sometimes outright hostile countries at each of their cardinal directional borders. Tanya, during the live fire exercises she's a part of, comes across an invading force from the Entente Alliance, a Norway-Sweden analog, as they rush into the Empire's controlled territory of Norden, which is basically Denmark. Tanya successfully repels the mages led by Anson Sue, her adversary for the time being, by sacrificing herself in a massive, air quotes here, act of self-sacrifice, by overloading her computation orb that allows her to fly and solve the formulas for magic. And look at that, she just so happens to survive. That is, Tanya's entire goal is to survive. And, live a quiet life. Surviving her heroic suicide attempt and having saved a number of soldiers in the process by crippling the enemy mage advance, she's given the highest military honor, Silver Wings Assault Badge, a decoration usually reserved for the dead who sacrifice themselves. And with that, she's sent to the rear as an instructor/guinea pig to test an experimental computation orb for mages. She meets a crazy doctor developing a computation orb so advanced no one can actually use it because it's considered the next gen of the next gen. This causes the revolutionary quad-core computation orb to frequently explode with magic power due to people struggling to use its 4 cores in synchronization. Fed up and putting in a transfer request after exploding one too many times, I guess, Tanya has one last test that results in a success due to divine intervention turning the experimental Lenium Type 95 into a holy relic, and subsequently the most advanced combat orb out there. Just one problem. Only she can use it due to the complexity of synchronizing the cores, with the drawback of now having to spew religious garbage that erodes Tanya's mind so said cores will actually sync up, which is the greatest insult to a free person like her. From there, her transfer is approved and she's sent to the Rhine front, after the Francois Republic declared war following the Entente Alliance declaration during the border crossing. The Empire's worst fear of encirclement by outside forces is coming to fruition, as the much stronger Republic is assisting the annoying Alliance by diverting the army on two fronts. The Rhine is particularly perilous, as the army holding it is a small force, while the main force, called the Great Army, was sent up north to take on the Alliance, but is now almost immediately being recalled to go fight off the Republic. On the Rhine, Tanya racks up a number of confirmed kills, making her a named mage, or ace of aces in Air Force terms, becoming a battle-hardened fighter and attaining the nickname the Devil of the Rhine that follows her for the rest of the series, due to the ruthless way she kills or maims all enemies she sees. After meeting and training a Rusi Federation refugee who is drafted due to her magic aptitude, named Victoria Sabrarikov, and lastly promoted to First Lieutenant, Tanya is sent back to the capital to join the War College and become a commissioned officer. There she tries to persuade a fellow officer to take a position in the rear, named Uger, so that he'll stay out of the way of her promotion track, and that doesn't really succeed as well as she hopes. Then after graduation, she's promoted to major due to impressing one of the highest-ranking military leaders in the entire country with her foresight and strategies. Graduating near the top of her class, she's bestowed with the title Von, making her Tanya von Dolgorichov. Having proposed a plan of an easily deployed, highly mobile squad to put out fires, she's, unfortunately, given a unit of aerial mages to command and train called the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion under the direct command of the General Staff, ruining her plans for an easy job in the rear. After barely surviving their rush training, the battalion's first mission is to intercept the now invading Dacia army to the south. This is the ever-important trial by fire for the battalion that will turn them from rookies into vets. They successfully, almost single-handedly actually, decimate the invading army and neutralize the Dacia threat post-haste. After their baptism by blood, the battalion and Tanya are sent up north to do some cleanup duty to finish off the Alliance after the Great Army had to pull back to fight on the Rhine. She makes a splash by cutting off the Alliance advance and taking out a Commonwealth espionage mission. That's the United Kingdom analog in this world, which makes them suspect a traitor in their midst, due to them being so secretive, so they think no one could actually find them. After this, however, we meet up with Anson Sue again, where he's given a machine gun by his daughter, Mary, to help him out. It's a super special one that's engraved and can shoot magic bullets, so it's actually pretty nice. Tanya and her battalion are thrown into an operation to cut off the Alliance supply line, so they get an airdrop and sneak attack from behind. During this, she meets Colonel Anson Sue once again, and the two face off where she beats him head on. This leads to a successful decapitation tactic in the north, effectively making the Alliance government crumble, while fleeing in exile. After their victory in the northern front is all but secured, the Aerial Mage Battalion is sent on one last recon mission in the seas to stop the Alliance fleet from getting away. They happen upon it in a massive storm, and seeing that they're outmanned and gunned, they dive bomb a random ship that just so happens to be carrying a VIP to the Commonwealth. This is where Tanya meets Anson Sue for one final time, running out of ammo and ramming him through with a bayonet. She steals the gun his daughter gifted him, and they continue their charge. After pulling back, Tanya and her troops stumble across another ship from the Commonwealth, transferring a dignitary from the Alliance via submarine, and this is where she dodged a bullet through sheer international law abuse. This is when the Commonwealth is absolutely confident they have a spy, as the same unit has now ruined their plans 3 times, even though it's a pure coincidence. Love that writing. Now Tanya and her troops are sent to the Rhine again, where the situation is dire with full-on trench warfare. She's given some troops to train up and supplemental lessons due to the strained manpower situation back home, and after getting them into shape, she's dragged back to the rear to deal with a sudden Republic-supported insurrection in the imperial town of Aren. Tanya's unit expertly utilizes international law again to destroy the rebelling population and the Republic troops despite the legal gray area. Once that's taken care of and setting the groundwork for later battles in the series, Tanya's unit is eventually tasked to end the war in the Rhine by doing another decapitation tactic where her unit penetrates deep into enemy territory. There she'll destroy their command and allow the army to encircle and annihilate the Republican army. While doing that, she destroys another Commonwealth espionage facility and the Republic Rhine HQ while she's at it. From there, Tanya wants to pursue and stop the remaining forces from retreating to the southern colonies, but is prevented by a formal ceasefire. She has some strong words for her superiors, but is shot down to just follow orders and enjoy their victory. We check in on Mary after her father's death at the hands of Tanya, where she's sad to learn that her father died in battle, but she doesn't know Tanya did it. And thus the war continues in the southern continent, where Tanya suffers the crushing realization that the Imperial HQ has zero intention of ending the war. That right there will take you up to about the end of the third volume, so talking for anything beyond that's going to be spoilers for non-light novel readers, which is why we're going to call it quits there for the plot portion of this video. But don't shut it off just yet. There's a lot more to come because I wanted to talk about the technical aspects of the books. Not that you couldn't tell by how much longer this video is, because I'm sure I'm only a third of the way through it. This script was pretty long. So let's touch on things that I liked, things they did right, and some of the things I thought were pretty stupid because, holy shit, there's a lot of that in this. But I guess that does mean we'll be talking about the differences between the light novel and the anime, so at least you got something to look forward to. Some of the major differences between the anime and light novels are the perspective of a lot of scenes. We as readers are, almost infuriatingly so, aware of Tanya's thoughts at any given moment where she's the point of view character. That's not to say being aware of what the main character is thinking is a bad thing, but Tanya's incredibly wordy and roundabout with her thought process for being incredibly logical in how she systematically comes to conclusions. This means a lot of scenes in the anime where Tanya looks egregiously evil are recontextualized through her logic, reasoning, and motivations suddenly being made available to the audience. But it makes you understand the extent of why she comes to her decisions, as well as the 30 other possibilities she considered to mitigate the blowback against herself, or at least secure an out. For instance, when she's a second lieutenant on her first tour in the Rhine, she doesn't send her subordinates off to a pillbox to be slaughtered, as she did in the anime. The two became rebellious in the novels after their training was called into question, and that was when both Tanya and her company commander at the time agreed that they couldn't babysit them on the front line, so they transferred them to the rear line, not necessarily knowing the position they'd be sent to. The section of the chapter is in Visha's perspective, and she mentions seeing a pillbox blown up as a passing thought, which is sort of left unsaid that was those guys, but it's pretty easy to see what happened, Knowing Tanya's book character, those two were certainly the farthest thing from her mind by that point, as she'd be focused on the battle at hand or thinking about the wastes of the free market war was, or how shitty being X is. In the anime, Tanya willfully sends them off to that post, knowing that they would die, and it's framed as her taking revenge for their insubordination, which is similar, but sabotages her character hard, because she's the type of person who would more than likely shoot someone for insubordination rather than get convolutedly malicious. Tanya doesn't like waste and isn't a roundabout person, so her character is drummed up a bit to be more ruthless rather than selfishly utilitarian. As an aside, Visha's pretty shocked about Tanya killing them in the anime. In the novel, she couldn't really give a shit. She's more just happy to be alive and not in a pillbox, dying. So characterization changes quite a bit from the source and adaptations. Probably the biggest difference between the versions of this franchise, at least from a plot perspective, is arguably the main antagonist, Being X. In the anime, the version most people are familiar with, Being X is the opposing force in Tanya's life. He threw her into the new world, corrupted the Type 95, gave Anson Sue a boost to his magic, and did the same for Mary Sue so they both could be a sort of power balance to her. This is to act as the sort of primary opposing force to give Tanya something to fight against in the series. The struggle is a personal one, of a faithless person who won't accept God, and a spiteful deity. That's completely absent from the novels. As of Volume 8, Being X hasn't had an appearance in the books since the prologue of the first volume. Further, its portrayal is that of a standard old man god type, with a mixture of religions between the Ten Commandments and inspiration from Buddhism, where there's a cycle of reincarnation that needs to be broken free from with enlightenment. This is all the basic information in the initial meeting between the soon-to-be Tanya and him. While the script is essentially unchanged between versions of the story, Being X is less sure, more frustrated with humanity as a whole, and washes his hands of this particular atheist rather than starting a feud with him. In the light novels, Being X is almost unconcerned with Tanya after their initial confrontation. The cycle of reincarnation is supposedly on the verge of collapse due to humans lacking faith, the source that fuels it, and Being X is worried about that, since the tool for humans to understand the divine, science, is leading them astray in his views, so they won't reach divinity on their current path. After throwing Tanya into this world, Being X does not appear after that point. As an anime-only viewer, you would logically point to Type 95's blessing as his next appearance, but that's administered by an archangel after that archangel's suggestion, some bureaucratic approval, and in an effort to foster faith by creating a new holy relic. The next mention after that is in some light novel spoilers, and again, that wasn't Being X, but another angelic being looking to build more religious faith in humanity. So in the books, Tanya's up against a whole holy pantheon instead of just an omnipotent god. But worst of all, it's entirely one-sided, because the entities pretty much ignore whatever she has to say anytime she meets them. But this also builds off the idea that there's less direct meddling. Her awful situations are less how the chips fell, and more implied by the author that this is how Being X is tipping the scales to build Tanya's faith, giving her an endless war to fight with increasingly dire situations. The slow and steady approach to wear her down instead of direct obstacles. Mary and Anson Sue are another massive change between the iterations of the series. In the anime, Anson isn't quite killed by Tanya off the coast of the Osfjord. He's hospitalized and recovers, only to be sent out to fight on the Rhine front by the Republican Commonwealth, after they recover him, of course. It's at this point we're shown he's made some sort of pact with Being X to gain more power in an effort to be a sort of balance to Tanya's immense magical power. It doesn't work, however, and he's killed. Big surprise. But his daughter signs up for the Unified States Army later and gains power on par with that of Tanya's. Or maybe it's greater, who knows. But that's dismissed as her being innately strong. In the novels, however, Anson never makes such a pact with Being X. His death is pretty anticlimactic. Mary's a pretty normal girl in the series, not given any special attention besides being nice and naive. She's more a balance for Tanya in terms of personality. When she gets word that her father died in battle, she's sad and signs up. Not really to get revenge for her father, but altruistically, as a volunteer to take back the Entente Alliance from the occupying empire. So yeah, she really only signs up out of a sense of duty because she's a mage, not because there's some higher calling to get revenge. Not that that doesn't come into play later, but wasn't her sole motivator. Good news is we'll get to talk a lot more about Mary in a later video. And in some minor notes, Lurgan's initial impression of Tanya isn't so much that she's a flat-out monster. It's terror that he and his country made Tanya, as opposed to Tanya's just that evil. And he's scared that she's the future of the country, the ideal perfect child soldier. Events in the books are condensed in the anime, creating a more streamlined and almost abridged account, by mashing related things together to create stronger, more plot-important moments. Tanya's powers played a little loose in the anime, as it's not always really shown that Type 95 is the source of her immense power, at least most of the time. It just feels like chanting religious nonsense gives her more magic, but in the books it's very clear she's activating Type 95. Aside from her telling the reader that she's doing it, she starts doing things that she can't normally do. And sticking with that, mages don't need special vehicles and such to fly besides an orb and staff, and the staff is their guns, it's their rifles. That's their staff. And speaking of mages, the battalion lacks any strong characterization, as the only ones we really get to know are Visha, Weiss, and Grants. And there's another one that we don't really meet until about 6 novels in, but that's also implying that he's developed, and he's not. All the characters are really watered down, and that's something the anime did do a good job of, was bringing more personality to the supporting cast. For the books though, the rest of the battalion's never mentioned by name, and we just know them as war nuts, and their only ever trait that's mentioned is that they're elites. Oh wow, we just build such a strong connection with these characters. Caught up? Good. With that, I think we can finally talk about the nuts and bolts of this book. Because, holy hell, there's a lot to talk about in case you couldn't tell. These are called light novels, and when you're averaging about 300 pages per book, you may have lost the right to use that term. And I know other light novel series have books about that long too, but when you're physically this big, and your print is only that big, it's a good indication that you might need to scale it back a bit. Because others are smaller, physically, and have way bigger print. What was I talking about again? Oh right, my criticisms for this series, because those are certainly plentiful. But you know what, let's try and end this video on a positive note, because I do have some praise. There's a lot of problems with this series in terms of its writing, most of which stem from its origins in serialized fiction. Off the top of my head, that'd be the lack of a strong plot direction, meandering threads that just go nowhere, and how loose this series plays with its characters. They're introduced, they're important, and then dropped out of nowhere, never to be seen or heard from again. And that's not something I'm going to blame on the translators, because it's not their fault these books ended up as thick as a Bible, especially since the Japanese versions of these are usually 100 pages longer, but in case you're wondering what I'm actually talking about here, I'm talking about the length. These things are incredibly wordy. I'd already mentioned this when talking about Tanya's inner monologue, like with how long-winded she is, and that's not just a quirk of her characterization. Tanya's typical train of thought, since we're privy to it, is roughly as follows when someone introduces an idea to her. She'll dismiss the idea as absurd, but then decides to humor the idea for a brief moment. So what if that idea was true? The circumstances for that would also mean that this whole host of other things are true, which would change the situation entirely, of course. But that can't be. Unless Tanya suddenly interjects with the exact motivation the other party would need, and usually has for whatever problem that's being proposed, and suddenly it all snaps into place. She'll then run through a whole list of reasons the proposed idea suddenly makes perfect sense, and what impact that'll have on the war effort, as well as her personal situation, and I could get that. That alone would take about 3 pages of how Tanya talks and how thorough she is when considering something, but interject about 3 asides about military history, free market capitalism, and how much being X is a piece of shit to bloat it out to about 5 pages, for a decision that ultimately amounts to accepting her orders. I'm fine understanding how she reasons, as that's one of the defining aspects of Tanya's character, and the asides give her more personality than your average isekai protagonist, so don't get me wrong there, but it's not necessary for every decision, and this does it for every decision, which bloats the book. Repetition as a whole is a big problem. For more concrete examples, Volume 2 is one of the most egregious parts of the series, as it has the Battle of Aran towards the back of it. This chapter is told in such an infuriating way in the book, because interspersed in chapters, occasionally, are sections from the perspective of a Commonwealth reporter in quote-unquote modern day, that's basically the 1960s. He's essentially trying to uncover what really happened during the war, and whatever he's reporting on in that chapter is usually presented as vague rumors, or buried military secrets, but for the audience it's pretty clear he's always doing a story on Tanya's exploits, even though he's never aware of that. The chapter starts with him talking about the Battle of Aran and what the Empire did there, how it skirted international law to engage in urban warfare by getting the citizens there to declare themselves enemy combatants. He talks about the General Staff strategy on how they did it, and how an unnamed soldier there got the citizens to admit that they were. So a good jumping in point for Tanya's perspective would be the battle itself, right? Instead, we get a crumpled up letter from the General Staff's debate detailing their decision, then thrown into a discussion between 2 unnamed soldiers on the Rhine front discussing the plan we were just told about. Then a flashback to Tanya proposing the plan a year prior while she was still in the War College. Then to her unit actually executing the plan with intermittent breaks from the viewpoint of a Republican soldier, who is our new Anson Sue. And by that I mean he'll lose relevance in a few volumes. And this chapter could have just been the first section and a firefight. That would have covered it. Instead, it spent so much time telling us information that we already knew from different perspectives, without adding anything new to it. And that's a waste of my time. I'm not kidding when I say you could cut half of these books out and lose nothing in terms of plot. Repetition, dead plot threads that go nowhere or just have underwhelming payoff, as well as just incredibly drawn out confrontations. I can't even count how many characters get sections of chapters told from their perspective, have names, and are presented as important, only to disappear after the author's lost interest in them. But I think one of the hardest points to criticize about this series is the level of its writing. This is written for the young adult demographic, but it's written at a high school level. And for those who don't grasp the gravity of that, most novels aimed at adults are written at around the 7th to 8th grade level. And that's so that they're a relaxing read as opposed to homework. Look, I consider myself to have a fairly robust vocabulary, but there were a few points that I had to grab my phone and Google a word for context. And while there are footnotes to help you with the more obscure history references, you can certainly tell that this was written by a military history otaku. Keeping track of the references is honestly tiresome, especially when they're entirely buried in Tanya's frequent asides and have no real relevance other than to signal boost how much Tanya knows. So all of these sort of culminate in the series being fairly unfocused. Just how many times Tanya's jump theaters or missions is a good indicator of that. But is that the result of a bored author who can't decide, or someone really trying to capture the scope of a world war? And as embarrassing as this is, I don't know the answer. I can't tell if that's brilliant or just really shit writing. Which brings me to my praise for this series on what it does better than the anime, or just does well in general. The addition of magic in a turn-of-the-century war setting like World War I isn't just a cheap gimmick like you might think. Magic in this series is very solidly defined, has strong limitations, and captures the feel of new technology like what was happening during the First World War. Firstly, magic is a science in this series, one that's only recently been understood with the development of computation orbs. That's what makes the Type 95 so revolutionary. It's not just a quad-core computer while the rest of the world's using 8-bit, it's able to fixate mana in space, a never-before-seen feat, allowing users to store magic for later use. Which brings me to what is magic in this series. It's a physical phenomena, with formulas used to solve equations of the world that make certain effects happen, such as an explosion. That's why mages are so useful in this franchise, as by Tanya's own admission, they've got the combat capabilities of a helicopter gunship with similar operational altitudes and firepower. Introducing that into the delicate war situation is what opens this franchise up creatively to explore these what-if scenarios. But where anime fans jumping into this may be disappointed, this really isn't an action series. The light novels are incredibly methodical with discussions of strategy and political backroom dealings. The firefights and battles are mostly glossed over, where Tanya might shoot a bit, deploy some formulas, fly in formation, and then the target blows up. That's about the depth of the descriptions you're getting. But the real engagement comes in seeing the various factions fighting for their own interests among the political landscape of a world war. Spies trying to procure supplies, Tanya trying to move up in the ranks, and the occasional glimpse to the other side to see how they view the war situation. It captures how awful war is, from everyone's perspective, but also why humans can't put an end to it. How the machine keeps trudging forward, despite everyone wanting it to stop. And that's the hopelessness this book series captures. One that the anime, with all of its visual flair, really just doesn't manage for me. And the worst part, there's storylines in these books I wish were more developed. In the end of the first volume, Tanya sort of snaps out of a daze while giving a speech to her troops, and has some serious deja vu. After visiting an army doctor for a checkup, she's wondering why she's not developing. Basically why she's not hitting puberty or even really growing. The doctor gives her pity and reaffirms that she needs to get more sleep and proper nutrition, which she can't in the army. But that's an interesting thread that's been dropped completely, because after using the Type 95, Tanya suddenly has gaps in her memory, and finds herself wanting to mature as a woman, despite still identifying mentally as a man. And curiously, now there's a rosary around her neck that she doesn't seem to remember. Type 95 not just making her lose control of her mouth to praise God, but actually change her personality? That's an incredibly interesting direction the story could go, tackling that concept of how religious faith alters your perceptions. Too bad it's dropped by the next book. Never brought up again, because Tanya only uses the Type 95 a few times after that. Like, only when she really needs to. Basically when she's about to die. Which just makes her slip religious phrases into her speech subconsciously for a bit. Sometimes, that's over with before the battle's even finished, so it doesn't even hold a lasting impact. Talk about a waste of potential. In terms of which is a better viewing experience, the anime is more action-packed and does a better job at telling Tanya's story through grouping events together, and just generally tightening up the whole narrative. But the books have a more complex web of characters, countries, and motivations, and that's used to great effect by playing up the political drama aspect. The anime is a great abridged version of the novels, for those with short attention spans, but lacks a lot of the messaging that I find makes this franchise stand out. I'm almost scared that abridged has become synonymous with parody. Don't think the anime is a parody of the books. I'm gonna do another video at least on this franchise because there's a lot to talk about and the anime really doesn't get into it that far, considering it covers roughly 3 volumes. That means that there's at least 8 translated English volumes and 4 more after that in Japanese. But those will probably be more straightforward book reviews. And hey, for now, you've made it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and do all the other YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. You can also join my Discord with a link down in the description. If you really want to support me, you can head on over to my Patreon. There you can pick up some extra perks, like voting on what I do next. And speaking of Patreon, I'd like to give a special thanks to Nadeshiko for their continued support. Thanks for watching. I had too many damn books.